They said there was a man, richer than nations, a ghost who could buy the world twice over, and still have change for dessert. No photos, no interviews, just whispers in government hallways, and numbers buried in dusty ledgers. Every country owes him. Presidents return his calls, wars pause for his signature. And yet, no one knows his name. I've chased rumors from Wall Street to back alleys in Zurich. Every lead slammed shut in my face. But I'm close now. Too close. And what I found changes everything. Why do countries borrow at all? Here's the full story. There are actually 5 big reasons countries go into debt. And each one is kind of like a chapter in a crime novel. First up, the budget gap. Imagine the government's got $3 trillion in tax money, but needs $4 trillion to keep the lights on. That's a $1 trillion hole. They could raise taxes, but just ask France what happened in 2018 when they tried a small fuel tax. The Yellow Vest protests brought cities to a standstill. Cutting spending? Same problem. The UK tried that after 2010, and it set off years of strikes and protests. So, they borrow. It's the easiest way to keep things calm, at least for now. Then there's the growth gamble. This is the smart kind of debt, spending big now to grow the economy faster. The US did it in the 1950s with the interstate highway system. That project cost $114 billion back then, over $600 billion today. But it linked up the entire country, boosted trade, and paid for itself many times over. Germany did something similar after World War II with the Autobahn, and it helped spark their economic miracle. Sometimes, though, borrowing isn't about plans. It's about survival. Like in 2020 during COVID-19. The US borrowed $3.8 trillion. That's 18% of the entire economy, just to keep businesses afloat and people in their homes. Without it, we'd have been looking at mass unemployment and maybe even a depression. Of course, there's also the debt shuffle, taking out new loans to pay off old ones. It sounds reckless, but it's a common move. Argentina kept rolling over loans until 2001, when it defaulted on $100 billion, the largest in history. The result? Empty fuel stations, mass protests, and a government collapse. And finally, the market move. Sometimes governments borrow not because they need cash, but to tweak the economy, to control inflation or interest rates. It's like a gambler trying to influence the odds at a casino. Done well, it keeps the economy stable. Done badly? Well, let's just say you don't want to find out. The suspects. Who lends the money? The first clue came from the numbers. The US alone has about $36 trillion in national debt. Japan? More than 1 quadrillion yen. That's over 9 trillion US dollars. Which is about 260% of its GDP, the highest ratio in the developed world. If one person held all this debt, Elon Musk would be asking him for a loan. So I dug it. It turns out, most of this money doesn't belong to a single billionaire, or even a shadowy banking dynasty. In fact, one of the biggest lenders to the US is the American people themselves. As of early 2025, about 40% of US debt is held domestically, in the form of treasury bonds owned by pension funds, insurance companies, banks, and even regular folks. That means if you've ever bought a US savings bond, part of the national debt is literally yours. But that still left a huge chunk unaccounted for. Who holds the rest? Following the money trail took me overseas. I found that foreign governments are major players in this game. As of 2025, Japan holds about $1.1 trillion in U.S. Treasury bonds, while China holds roughly $775 billion. Other countries like the UK, Luxembourg, and Switzerland hold hundreds of billions more. It's less about generosity and more about safety. U.S. debt is seen as one of the safest investments in the world, like a vault that never gets robbed. Then there are the giant institutions, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and the International Monetary Fund, IMF. These aren't your typical rich lenders. They're coalitions of nations pooling resources to loan to countries in trouble. The IMF alone has lent money to over 90 countries in the past 3 decades, often during financial meltdowns, like Greece in 2010 or Argentina in 2018. Finally, I arrived at the most unexpected suspect of all, the central banks. When a government borrows from its own central bank, the bank can simply create the money to buy government bonds. It's called debt monetization, and while it sounds like free cash, it can wreck a currency if overdone. Zimbabwe in the late 2000s and Venezuela in the 2010s are textbook examples, with inflation rates in the millions of percent. The truth was now clear. There's no single mysterious trillionaire. The richest man alive is really a network, made up of regular citizens, foreign governments, global institutions, and central banks. And the deeper I looked, the more I realized this system is less about one person's wealth and more about everyone's trust. The debt's double-edged sword. Here's where things get tricky. National debt isn't always a villain. In fact, used wisely, it can be the hero of the story. Think of it like a sharp knife. In the hands of a skilled chef, it creates a gourmet meal. In the wrong hands, someone's losing a finger. Let's start with the good debt side. After World War II, the United States had a debt-to-GDP ratio of about 119%, even higher than today. On paper, that looked terrifying. But instead of cutting everything to the bone, the U.S. used that debt to rebuild both itself and its allies. The Marshall Plan alone, about $13 billion at the time, over $150 billion in today's money, helped Europe get back on its feet. Countries rebuilt factories, repaired infrastructure, and reopened trade routes. That debt wasn't just numbers in a ledger. It was an investment that kick-started decades of prosperity, turning war-ravaged Europe into one of the most productive regions on Earth. And it's not just post-war recovery. Think about the U.S. interstate highway system in the 1950s. Funded partly by borrowing, it spanned over 41,000 miles, cost more than $500 billion in today's dollars, and transformed the economy. It allowed goods to move faster, businesses to expand nationwide, and tourism to boom. Every dollar borrowed to build those roads came back many times over in economic growth. But then there's the bad debt side, borrowing for consumption rather than production. Imagine maxing out your credit card not for a business investment, but for fancy dinners and vacations. That's what some countries do, taking on loans to fund short-term political promises instead of projects that create future income. The result? A debt trap. Take Sri Lanka as the cautionary tale. By 2022, it owed $51 billion in external debt. The problem wasn't just the amount. It was that too much went into vanity projects and inefficient spending, like an underused airport and a port leased to China for 99 years. When tourism collapsed during COVID-19, the country couldn't earn enough foreign currency to pay its loans. Protests erupted, the president fled, and the nation defaulted. And here's a stat that puts it in perspective. In 2023, the U.S. spent $659 billion just on interest payments for its national debt, more than its entire defense budget in the early 2000s. If that interest bill keeps growing faster than the economy, it starts crowding out other spending, less money for healthcare, education, or infrastructure. So IO's insight makes perfect sense here. Credit isn't a chain. It's a tool for coordination and production. But misuse it, and it becomes a chain around the country's neck. The myth of the debt-free country. People love to imagine a perfect nation. No crime, no pollution, and no debt. But in reality, no major economy on Earth is completely debt-free. Even the richest countries borrow. Why? Because debt isn't just a sign of trouble, it's also a financial tool. The closest thing to debt-free today is Macau, a tiny Chinese territory with around 700,000 residents and an economy built on casinos that rake in more money than Las Vegas. With its small size, about half of Manhattan, and massive gambling revenue, it's managed to avoid large public debt. But Macau isn't even a sovereign country, so it doesn't count. For actual nations, debt serves important functions. Government bonds, which are technically debt, are considered one of the safest investments in the world. Pension funds, insurance companies, and even your grandma's retirement savings rely on them. If a country suddenly wiped out all its debt, it would remove this safe asset from the market, forcing savings into riskier investments. Plus, being debt-free often means either huge spending cuts or massive tax hikes, both of which can strangle economic growth. In the modern financial world, some debt, if managed well, is not only normal, it's healthy. Every country owes someone, but the truth isn't what you think. If you enjoyed uncovering the mysterious lender, hit like, subscribe, and watch our next big money mystery.